Welcome to Revolution Chronicles. A captured Luftwaffe pilot stood ready for the end hands bound, heart pounding, waiting for the rifle cracks that would seal his fate. But instead of a blindfold and a wall, the Americans handed him something he never dreamed of: an airplane. What followed was a story of mercy, trust, and survival that defied the cruelty of war. Like, share, and subscribe, and join us as we uncover this extraordinary tale. Asterisk, the skies over Europe in 1944 were a battlefield like no other. Every morning, the drone of engines rose like thunder as American bombers set out in endless formations, stretching from horizon to horizon. Behind them flew their escorts, P-51 Mustangs, fast and deadly, their polished noses gleaming in the sun. And waiting above, or lurking behind a cloud bank, were the hunters of the Luftwaffe, desperate to tear into the bomb streams before they could rain fire on German cities and factories. Our story follows one of those hunters, a young Luftwaffe pilot, just 23 years old, strapped inside his Messerschmitt Bf 109. He had been trained since boyhood to believe that honor was found in combat and that his duty was to the Reich. His instructors had hammered discipline into him, teaching him that the cockpit was his cathedral, the engine his hymn, and the kill his only prayer. That morning, he climbed through the cold air, condensation freezing against his canopy. His squadron had been scrambled to intercept a massive American raid bound for the industrial heartland of Germany. He knew what was coming. Hundreds of bombers stacked in tight formation, their .50 caliber machine guns bristling from every angle. And above them, the sleek fighters that would swarm like angry hornets the moment the Germans appeared. Still, he pressed forward. He had no choice. The attack began with a scream of vengeance. Diving from above, he aimed his guns at the lead bomber, the one that would throw the whole formation into chaos if it fell. Tracers lit up the sky, yellow and red sparks flying like sparks from a forge. For a few seconds, he felt the thrill of the hunt, the chase, the crack of his cannons, the dark plume of smoke rising from an American wing. But his joy was short-lived. Out of the corner of his eye, a Mustang dropped from the sun. Its 6 guns opened up at once, cutting through the air like a buzzsaw. Bullets tore across his fuselage. Glass shattered. His engine screamed in protest, then coughed, sputtered, and went silent. The Messerschmitt shuddered, nose dipping toward the earth. He fought the stick, trying desperately to keep the crippled plane level. The altimeter spun down. He knew it was over. With a quick motion, he unfastened his harness, yanked the canopy open, and hurled himself into the rushing air. The parachute bloomed above him, jerking his body as flak bursts echoed in the distance. Below, the fields of war-torn Europe stretched out like a patchwork of brown and gray. He floated helplessly, watching his smoking plane spiral downward, trailing fire, until it slammed into the earth with a sickening explosion. When he landed, it was not in friendly territory. American soldiers were already waiting, rifles raised, their faces hard. His hands went up instinctively. There was no fight left in him. The next moments blurred together. Rough hands shoved him to the ground, stripped him of his pistol, searched his pockets. He was dragged to a waiting truck, the canvas flapping in the cold wind. Other prisoners sat inside, silent, their faces pale. Some were bleeding, bandaged with makeshift cloths. No one spoke. For hours, the truck rattled over broken roads, carrying them deeper into enemy hands. Every bump jarred his bones. Every turn of the wheel brought him closer to a fate he could not stop thinking about: execution. That thought sat heavy in his chest like a stone. He had heard the stories pilots shot on the spot or lined up against walls. After all, had they not done the same to downed Allied airmen? The war was merciless. Why should he expect mercy? As the truck finally ground to a halt, the prisoners were herded out and lined up. A small farmhouse loomed nearby, windows dark, smoke rising faintly from a chimney. The Americans shouted orders he barely understood, pushing them into a barn that had been hastily converted into a holding pen. The smell of hay mixed with the sour odor of sweat and fear. Night fell. He lay on the cold ground, staring at the rafters above, each creak of the wood sounding like a clock ticking down to his final hour. He pictured the scene again and again, a blindfold tied tight. A squad of soldiers leveling rifles, the command shouted. The crash of gunfire. What he did not know was that his fate would not be sealed with bullets. His war was not ending. It was only beginning again in the strangest way imaginable. But in that barn, on that cold night, he was simply a defeated young man, shivering in his thin uniform, convinced he would never see another sunrise. Morning came not with the crack of rifles, but with the clatter of boots on frozen earth. The young Luftwaffe pilot rose from the straw-strewn floor, stiff and sore, his heart pounding. He braced himself for the command to march, for the blindfold, for the last steps of his life. But instead, the barn doors opened to reveal not a firing squad, but an American officer with a clipboard. Orders were barked. Interpreters stepped forward, and the prisoners were counted, searched again, and loaded onto another truck. Confusion filled the air. Some of the German airmen whispered. Others stared straight ahead in silence. None of them understood why they were still alive. The journey took days. Through shattered villages and across the scarred countryside, the convoy rolled. They passed destroyed tanks rusting in ditches, churches reduced to blackened shells, and long lines of refugees trudging with carts and bundles. For the young pilot, every mile felt like borrowed time. He kept waiting for the stop that would end in a shallow grave, but the trucks never turned toward a wall or a pit. Instead, they pressed westward, deeper into American-controlled territory. At last, they arrived at a sprawling compound ringed with barbed wire and guard towers. The gate clanged open, and the prisoners were marched inside. A wooden sign announced it plainly, a prisoner of war camp. The young pilot's fear gave way to disbelief. He had not been executed. He was not even in a dungeon. Instead, he was being registered, tagged, and assigned a number. His belongings were catalogued. He was given a wool blanket, a tin mess kit, and a cot in a long barracks. That first night, he lay awake in astonishment. There were guards, yes, and there was barbed wire. But there was also hot food, served 3 times a day. Not lavish, but enough to fill the stomach. Bread, soup, beans, even meat on occasion. For a man who had been living on scraps in a starving Germany, it felt unreal. The camp itself buzzed with strange rhythms. Prisoners walked in small groups, speaking quietly in German. Some played chess or cards. Others wrote letters that were collected, and to their surprise, sometimes delivered. There were rules, of course, strict rules, but there was also a strange sort of order, even a kind of routine. For the Luftwaffe pilot, it was deeply unsettling. His commanders had told him the Americans were brutal, that surrender meant torture or death. Yet here he was, sleeping under a roof, eating rations, treated not with kindness exactly, but with a kind of cold fairness. Days turned into weeks. He learned the guards' routines, their habits. Some were friendly, even joking with the prisoners in broken German. Others kept their distance, their faces hard, their rifles always at the ready. What struck him most was the difference in spirit. Among the Americans, there was no desperation, no gnawing hunger, no fear of air raids. They carried themselves with confidence, as men who believed the war was already won. For a young German who had been raised on tales of inevitable victory, it was a sobering revelation. Inside the camp, rumors spread like wildfire. Some prisoners swore they had seen captured Luftwaffe pilots taken away, never to return. Others whispered that those men had been sent to America itself, across the ocean, to secret camps where they were interrogated for months. The young pilot didn't know what to believe. Then, one morning, he was summoned. Two guards escorted him to a small building near the edge of the camp. Inside, seated at a desk, was an American officer flanked by an interpreter. Papers were stacked neatly on the desk. The officer looked him over, not with cruelty, but with the cool appraisal of a man weighing possibilities. Questions followed endless questions. About his unit, his aircraft, his training. What altitudes did the Messerschmitt climb best at? How did the Focke-Wulf turn compared to the Mustang? What tactics did the Luftwaffe teach against bombers? The pilot answered cautiously, sometimes truthfully, sometimes evasively. He wasn't sure what they wanted. He feared every word might be twisted into a rope for his neck, but the Americans did not threaten him. They simply took notes, asked again, and dismissed him. He was returned to his barracks. Over the following weeks, the interrogations continued. Slowly, the pilot realized a strange truth. The Americans were not just curious. They were studying him, not as a man, but as a resource, a living key to unlocking the secrets of the LUFTWFFE. It was unsettling, but it also sparked something dangerous inside him, hope. If they needed him, if his knowledge was useful, then perhaps he was safe from execution. He began to notice things he had missed before. Now and then, a German pilot would be quietly removed from the camp. The rumor was always the same. They were being taken to fly again, not for Germany, but for America. The German pilot nodded. His hands slipped into the gloves almost automatically. These were rituals he knew by heart. Mounting the ladder, sliding into the cockpit, running his fingers along the throttle and stick, it was muscle memory. For a moment, the years of war melted away, and he was simply a flyer again. But trust did not come easy. On the ground, the American soldiers tightened their grips on their rifles, ready for the worst. What if he takes off and never comes back? Someone asked. What if he dives this bird into the hangars? The major's reply was cold. Then we shoot him down before he clears the tree line. And yet, there was a silence that hung over them all. They weren't just watching an enemy. They were watching a man forced into an impossible crossroads. Would he cling to the loyalty drilled into him by the Reich, or would he seize the chance at life, even if it meant working with those he had once sworn to kill? The pilot slid the canopy closed and studied the unfamiliar dials. Some he recognized instantly: altimeter, fuel gauge, oil pressure. Others were strange, arranged differently than in his beloved Messerschmitt Bf 109. He adjusted quickly, relying on instinct. When his gloved hand pushed the starter, the engine coughed, then roared to life. Dust swirled across the tarmac, and men shielded their eyes as the growl of American horsepower filled the air. Inside the cockpit, the German closed his eyes for half a second. The smell of fuel, the vibrations under his boots, it was the same in any army, any plane. For the first time since his capture, he felt alive. They weren't about to let him loose in open skies. Not yet. The plan was simple. Taxi the plane, test the systems, maybe take a short lift off under strict escort. 2 American fighters waited on standby, engines hot, ready to pursue if he tried to escape. Every man on the base was on edge. The pilot eased the jug forward. The wheels rolled over gravel, then asphalt. The massive propeller chopped the morning air. Mechanics stepped back, craning their necks. Guards followed every movement with rifles ready. And then he opened the throttle. The plane surged forward, heavier than what he was used to, but steady. His body pressed back against the seat as the Thunderbolt picked up speed. For a brief second, the Americans thought he might bolt. But just before the critical moment, he pulled the throttle back, slowing the beast to a crawl. The jug coasted to a halt, dust billowing around its wheels. The major let out the breath he didn't know he'd been holding. Asterisk. The cockpit canopy slid open. The German pilot didn't smirk, didn't gloat. He simply looked down at the Americans waiting below. For the first time, there was no hatred in his eyes, just a strange calm, the kind that comes when a man has faced death and been handed an unexpected second chance. No one applauded. No one cheered. But in that silence, something shifted. The Americans saw not a fanatic, not a monster, but a man of flesh and blood skilled, weary, and caught in a war larger than himself. And the German pilot, for his part, felt a spark he hadn't known in years, the faint possibility of redemption. Asterisk, the moment had come. No more taxi runs, no more idle engines. The Americans wanted to see if their gamble could truly pay off. A man who had once tried to shoot them out of the sky was about to climb into one of their own machines and take flight. The weight of the decision hung heavy on the airfield, like a storm pressing down. The major gave the order with a flat voice. Let him fly. Every head turned as the German strapped back into the cockpit. His hands moved with ease, each motion practiced, precise. He had spent years learning the art of flight, and here at the edge of death, in the land of his enemies, that skill was his only salvation. Asterisk, the canopy slid shut, and the ground crew stepped back. The German pilot pushed the throttle forward, feeling the roar build beneath him. Dust billowed up in clouds behind the jug as it sped down the runway. Soldiers lined the edges, rifles slung, jaws tight with suspicion. And then he was airborne. The wheels lifted off. The runway dropped away, and the thunderbolt surged into the blue morning sky. For a brief, breathless moment, every man below held his breath. Would he climb high and vanish toward the horizon? Would he turn the guns on the base itself? But instead, the pilot kept the jug steady, circling the airfield at altitude, his movements smooth and controlled. It was not the flight of a desperate man. It was the flight of a professional. Asterisk, 2 American fighters, P-51 Mustangs, roared up to flank him. Their silver wings glistened in the sun as they slid into formation, one on either side. Their pilots eyed him warily, fingers tense on the triggers. They were his escorts, but also his executioners, should he make one wrong move. Inside the jug, the German stole a glance at them. For the first time, he wasn't looking at enemies. He was looking at men who understood what it meant to be suspended between heaven and earth, with only wings and skill keeping you alive. It was the strange brotherhood of pilots' nationalities divided them. Politics chained them, but in the cockpit they were the same. Asterisk, the Americans pushed him. They had him perform rolls, climbs, dives, testing his ability to obey commands. They watched every move. At any second, if he turned away from their orders, he would be reduced to a fireball in the sky. But he didn't. The German pilot flew as if this were his squadron, as if these were his comrades. He brought the jug through maneuvers smoothly, reporting back through the radio in broken English. Engine strong. Controls responsive. His voice was calm, clipped, almost grateful. Below, the major watched through binoculars. He's not running, he muttered to his men. He's flying for us. Asterisk, after nearly an hour in the sky, the order came to bring him down. The pilot eased the jug into a gentle descent, lining up with the runway below. Dust rose as the wheels kissed the ground, the plane rattling as it slowed. Guards tightened their grips, ready for anything, but the German taxied neatly, cutting the engine and sliding open the canopy. He climbed down slowly, boots crunching against the gravel. There was no arrogance in him, no smirk. He simply looked at the Americans with quiet eyes and handed over the gloves. They'd loaned him. Not a word was spoken for several seconds. Then one of the mechanics, barely 20 years old, grease smeared across his face, spoke aloud what they were all thinking. Damn, he flew it like one of ours. Asterisk, the days that followed blurred. The German pilot was questioned, tested, pressed for every detail he knew. He explained how the Luftwaffe trained, how their tactics shifted as the war dragged on, how their aircraft compared to American steel. He became, in a strange way, a resource and enemy-turned-teacher. But something else happened too. The men who had once looked at him with only suspicion began to see him differently. They shared meals, short conversations, even laughter. War had stripped away so much humanity, yet in this unlikely place, a flicker of it returned. The pilot himself seemed to soften. No longer the stern, rigid officer of Hitler's Air Force, he now carried the air of a man humbled by fate and grateful for mercy. Asterisk, most prisoners of war did not get such treatment. Many died nameless, faceless in camps or under fire. But this man had been given something different, not freedom, but a chance. And in showing mercy, the Americans discovered something unexpected, that even an enemy, once stripped of symbols and slogans, was simply a man. And perhaps that was the greatest victory of all. Asterisk, as the war raged on. Stories like his faded into the background, swallowed by battles and bloodshed. But they mattered. They showed that even in the darkest chapters of history, humanity could flicker through the cracks. He had walked toward death expecting a blindfold and a wall. Instead, he found himself handed the controls of an American plane, trusted by those he had tried to destroy. It was an act that defied logic, but in that defiance lived a greater truth, that mercy can sometimes achieve what bullets never will dot. So when we remember the war, it's not only the battles, the victories, or the losses we should hold on to. It's these fragile, extraordinary moments when men remembered they were more than soldiers, more than enemies. They were human. And in the sky that day, above an airfield filled with suspicion and fear, a captured Luftwaffe pilot proved it. The idea seemed insane. How could an enemy pilot ever take to the skies again under the orders of the very men who had captured him? And yet the whispers would not stop. Some prisoners scoffed. Others swore it was true. The young pilot tried to dismiss it. But deep down, he felt a chill. Because part of him knew, in the way soldiers always sense what their commanders are planning, that something was being prepared. Something that involved him. For now, he remained in limbo. Alive, but uncertain. Waiting, always waiting, for a fate that was neither death nor freedom. In the stillness of those camp nights, he lay awake on his cot, staring at the rafters. He thought of home, of his mother's kitchen, of the girl he once walked with down the village lane. He thought of the Reich collapsing, of cities burning, of the war grinding to an end he could not control. And he thought, with a mix of dread and reluctant anticipation, of the sky, of the cockpit, of the roar of engines. He had been trained to fly and to fight. Was it possible that the Americans intended to give him wings again? Asterisk, the day began like any other in the camp roll call at dawn. Thin porridge in the mess hall, the shuffle of prisoners pacing behind barbed wire. But for the young Luftwaffe pilot, it would not end as an ordinary day. Late in the morning, his name was called. 2 guards appeared at the barracks door, rifles slung casually but firmly in their hands. He stood, heart thudding, and followed them across the yard. The eyes of fellow prisoners trailed him as he walked. Some looked away. Others gave him small, knowing glances. Rumors whispered once more in his ears men taken from camp, never to return. The guards led him not to the usual interrogation hut, but to a car waiting just outside the gates. It was a military jeep, dust clinging to its tires. Without explanation, they ordered him inside. He sat stiffly on the worn seat, the engine roaring to life as the jeep pulled away, leaving behind the wire fences, the watchtowers, and the familiar routines of captivity. They drove for hours through countryside scarred by war. Villages reduced to rubble, fields pockmarked by craters, bridges replaced with temporary wooden spans. Each turn of the road fed his unease. Where were they taking him? Was this finally the end? At last they arrived at an airfield. Rows of hangars lined the tarmac, and aircraft silhouettes gleamed in the sunlight. But these were not German machines. They were American sleek Mustangs and sturdy Thunderbolts, their stars and bars insignia bright against polished metal. The pilot felt his stomach twist. Why had they brought him here? He was escorted into a small office inside one of the hangars. Behind a desk sat an American officer, his uniform crisp, his manner calm but firm. An interpreter stood beside him. Papers were spread neatly across the desk. Along with a steaming cup of coffee, the officer gestured for him to sit. For a moment there was silence. The pilot could hear the distant roar of an aircraft taking off outside, the vibrations rattling the window panes. Then the officer leaned forward, eyes fixed on him, and spoke in measured tones. The interpreter translated, "We know who you are. We know what you've flown. We know what you've been trained to do. And we don't want to waste that." The words struck like a hammer. The young pilot frowned, not understanding. The officer continued, "You thought you'd be shot. You thought this was the end. But we have something else in mind. We want you to fly again." The room seemed to spin. Fly again? For the Americans? Surely he had misheard. The interpreter repeated it, slowly, clearly. "They want you to fly. For them." The German's heart pounded. He felt heat rising to his face, a surge of disbelief, of anger, of relief all tangled together. This had to be a trick. Why would his enemies ever trust him in an aircraft again? The officer explained. The Americans had captured German planes, Messerschmitts, Focke-Wulfs, even the revolutionary jet-powered Me-262. They needed to understand these machines, to learn their weaknesses, to teach their own pilots how to fight them. Books and blueprints could only tell so much. What they required was a man who had lived in those cockpits, who knew their limits, who could wring every ounce of performance from them. And that man, they told him, was sitting right there. The pilot's hands trembled. He stared down at them, rough with calluses, scarred from burns. Hands made for the control stick, the throttle, the instruments of flight. Hands that had sent men to their deaths. He thought of Germany, of the Reich collapsing under the Allied advance. He thought of his comrades, many already dead, others still fighting hopeless battles in the skies. To fly for the Americans would be betrayal. Yet what choice did he have? Refuse, and he might face the bullet after all. Accept, and he would live, though, at what cost to his honor. The officer's voice softened. "You are not our enemy anymore. Your war is over. You can die clinging to a dead cause, or you can help save lives by teaching us what we need to know." The words lingered. Save lives. Could that be true? Or was it just another mask of war? Finally, the interpreter asked, "Do you understand?" The German nodded slowly, though understanding was far from acceptance. His mind reeled. He had been ready to die, prepared for the crack of rifles. Instead, he was being offered wings. Later that afternoon, they brought him to the hangar floor. There, under bright lamps, stood a familiar silhouette, Messerschmitt Bf 109, captured intact. Its paint was worn, its crosses partly overpainted, but it was unmistakable. His aircraft. His machine-dot American mechanics circled it, studying, tinkering. But when they saw him approach, they stepped aside. It was as though they were waiting for him, the true owner of its secrets. The officer's words echoed again. "We want you to fly." He ran his hand along the fuselage, fingers brushing over the cold metal. Memories rushed back. The smell of fuel, The roar of the Daimler-Benz engine, the feel of the stick quivering under pressure. This was the world he knew, the only world where he felt alive. But this time, he would not be climbing into the cockpit as a defender of Germany. This time, he would be climbing in as a tool of the enemy. That night, he could not sleep. He sat in his quarters, staring at the ceiling, torn between fear and temptation. They had handed him an impossible choice: die for pride or live in shame. Refuse, and the war ended here. Accept, and it began again, on the strangest terms imaginable. As dawn broke, he knew the decision had already been made. He had the heart of a pilot, and a pilot's heart could not resist the sky. The morning sun broke across the horizon in thin streaks of gold. At the dusty American airfield, the captured Luftwaffe pilot stood with his wrists no longer bound. His boots sank slightly into the loose gravel as he squinted at the rows of aircraft lined up before him. He had been ready for a firing squad, and now he was staring at a squadron of machines that had defined the war itself. The Americans had taken an enormous risk. Every soldier on the base knew it. To hand control of one of their planes' symbols of national pride, tools of destruction, lifelines of their mission, to a man who had sworn loyalty to Hitler just weeks before. It was unthinkable. The young mechanics eyed him with suspicion, their wrenches and oily rags pausing mid-motion as whispers traveled down the line. Is this some kind of joke? One muttered under his breath. Not a joke, said another. Orders. The pilot, pale but composed, ran his eyes over the P-47 Thunderbolt parked in front of him. Its nose gleamed in the light, painted with the shark-like grin many American crews favored. To him, it was both familiar and foreign. He knew its reputation. The Jug, they called it, a beast of a plane, heavy, powerful, almost indestructible. He had fought against them over the skies of France and Germany. Now, fate had brought him to touch one, not as an enemy, but as its pilot. It wasn't madness. It was strategy. High command needed more than second-hand reports, more than the mangled wreckage of downed planes. They needed a man who understood German machines from the inside, a pilot who knew how the Luftwaffe thought, how they moved, how they fought. Manuals could be translated, engines could be studied, but instinct that belonged only to a man who had flown through flak and fire with the enemy cross on his wings. And so, an offer had been made. No promises of freedom, no guarantees of safety. Just one choice: fly for us, or rot in a cell with the war closing in. The pilot weighed it carefully. Death for honor was a concept he'd been raised to embrace. But hunger gnawed at his stomach, and the images of war cities burned. Comrades lost haunted him. Maybe, just maybe, survival was worth more than loyalty to a crumbling Reich. They walked him across the tarmac, 2 guards close at his side. His uniform had been stripped of insignia, replaced by a plain jacket and trousers. To look at him now, one wouldn't know he had once flown for Gring's Luftwaffe. But when he reached the plane, something flickered across his face, something the Americans noticed. It was reverence. Not for the stars on the fuselage, but for the machine itself. One of the American officers, a sharp-eyed major with a southern drawl, handed him a set of flight gloves. You know what this means, the major said flatly. One wrong move, and you won't see the ground again.